The Duke of Edinburgh title. For decades it was treated as a family formality, a quiet promise made by a dying monarch to a son who rarely made headlines. But in the summer of 2026, that promise stopped being quiet. Reports emerged that the arrangement Queen Elizabeth II had personally blessed for Prince Edward was now being treated as far more consequential than anyone at Buckingham Palace had let on. Not just a ceremonial gesture, but a real shift in what Edward stands to hold, and what it means for the line of succession beneath him. Insiders describe a palace scrambling to control the narrative, and at the center of it, according to multiple royal watchers, is Prince William, the future king, watching his uncle's position solidify in ways that reportedly caught even him off guard. Charles, meanwhile, is said to have made his final call on the matter. Whether it satisfies everyone in the family is another question entirely. Whether it holds up under the weight of everything happening in this family right now is another question entirely too. Welcome back to Royal Unbeatable, the channel dedicated to uncovering the stories the palace would rather keep behind closed doors. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because today we're breaking down exactly how this inheritance situation unfolded, what it means for William's future, and why Charles's decision might not be the end of this story. It might just be the beginning. Stick with us, because the details here go deeper than most headlines let on. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to 1999, the year Prince Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones. It was a wedding unlike any other royal event of its era. Understated, modern, almost deliberately unglamorous, compared to the spectacle that had surrounded his older siblings. Edward, the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, had spent much of his adult life trying to define himself outside the shadow of the monarchy. He'd left the Royal Marines partway through training, a decision that generated tabloid mockery for years and followed him well into adulthood. He'd tried his hand at television production, an industry far removed from royal tradition, and had struggled, publicly and repeatedly, to find his footing in a family built on hierarchy, precedent, and expectation. But his marriage to Sophie changed the tone of his public life. The two of them built a reputation as the most low-key, scandal-free couple in the family. A contrast that, over time, would matter more than anyone predicted back in the late 90s. At that wedding, Queen Elizabeth II made an unusual promise. Rather than granting Edward a dukedom immediately, as was customary for a monarch's son upon marriage, she deferred it. She let it be known that when the title eventually passed to Edward, it would be the Duke of Edinburgh, the title his father Prince Philip had held for over 6 decades, a title steeped in the identity of the family patriarch and inseparable from his decades of service alongside the Queen. It was, by royal standards, a deeply personal decision, one that suggested the Queen wanted the title to remain within living memory of Philip rather than be handed out and diluted elsewhere. And crucially, the agreement specified something else, something that would end up mattering far more than the title itself. Unlike most royal titles, this one would not pass down automatically to Edward's children. It would be held by Edward for his lifetime only, and would then revert back to the crown, leaving the king of the day, whoever that might be, free to grant it again to whomever he chose. At the time, few people outside royal circles paid much attention to that clause buried in the arrangement. Decades later, it would become the single most important detail in this entire story, the hinge on which everything else would eventually turn. Fast forward to Prince Philip's death in April 2021, at the age of 99, after more than 70 years of service to the crown. The Duke of Edinburgh title fell vacant for the first time in decades, and per the arrangement made 2 decades earlier at Edward's wedding, it was understood that Edward would eventually inherit it, but not immediately. Instead, King Charles held the title himself for a period following his mother's death and his own accession to the throne, a decision that raised eyebrows even then among royal commentators who had been tracking the succession of titles for years. Was it a temporary custodianship, a way of honoring his father's memory before formally passing the title on to his brother as originally intended? Or was Charles quietly reconsidering the entire arrangement his mother had made decades earlier, weighing whether it still made sense in the modern, slimmed-down monarchy he was beginning to design? For nearly a year and a half, nobody outside a very small circle knew for certain which explanation was correct. And that uncertainty, that prolonged silence from the palace, is where the real tension of this story begins. The turning point came in March of 2023, just weeks ahead of Charles's coronation, when Buckingham Palace finally confirmed that Edward would be created Duke of Edinburgh, with the added detail, spelled out explicitly in the official statement, that his son James would not automatically inherit the title, honoring the exact terms the late Queen had set out decades before at that quiet 1999 wedding. On paper, it looked like a happy resolution, a promise kept, a family legacy preserved, a tidy bow tied on a decades-old story. But according to royal commentators who've tracked the family's internal dynamics for years, the way the announcement was handled, the specific timing just before the coronation, the deliberate emphasis on the clause preventing automatic inheritance by James, suggested there had been real internal debate about it behind the scenes. Some analysts have pointed to reporting from veteran royal correspondent Camilla Tominey, who suggested that the structure of the deal was designed deliberately so that William, as the future king, would retain full control over whether one of his own children could one day hold the Edinburgh title, rather than seeing it locked permanently into Edward's branch of the family. In other words, this wasn't simply a gift to Edward, wrapped up neatly and handed over without complication. It was Charles threading a needle, honoring his father's wishes, rewarding his brother for decades of quiet loyalty, while making absolutely sure the door stayed open for William's family down the line, whenever that future moment arrived. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how unusual Edward and Sophie's approach to royal life has been, compared to nearly everyone else in the family. While Diana's story dominated headlines throughout the 90s, and while Charles and Camilla navigated years of public scrutiny before finally marrying in 2005, Edward and Sophie built something almost invisible by comparison. A marriage and a working royal partnership defined by consistency rather than drama. Sophie, in particular, has become one of the late Queen's most trusted confidants in her final years, reportedly spending considerable time with Elizabeth in her later life, accompanying her on private visits and earning a level of trust that few other royal spouses ever achieved. Royal historians have often pointed to this closeness as one possible explanation for why the Queen chose to entrust the Edinburgh title, and by extension, a piece of Philip's own legacy, to this particular branch of the family, rather than distributing royal honors more broadly among her other grandchildren and their spouses. That single detail, the idea that this title was never fully Edward's to keep in perpetuity, never something he could simply pass on to his son without royal permission, is what turned a straightforward inheritance story into something far more layered, and frankly, far more interesting than it appeared on the surface. Because while the general public saw a tidy family arrangement wrapped up just in time for a coronation, insiders describe a much more delicate balancing act happening behind palace walls, one that would only intensify as the years went on and as new details continued to surface. Isn't it strange how something that looked so simple on the surface, a title, a wedding gift, a nod to a beloved patriarch, could end up carrying this much weight 3 decades later? That's exactly what makes this story worth understanding properly, piece by piece, rather than just skimming the headlines. If the 2023 announcement seemed to settle the matter, what's happened since suggests otherwise. Because titles are only one piece of what inheritance means in the House of Windsor. The far bigger, far messier question has always been money. And that's where this story shifts from ceremonial symbolism into something with real financial teeth. Something that touches every single working member of this family and shapes how they live, year after year. When Queen Elizabeth II died in September of 2022, she left behind a private estate estimated at roughly £650 million. Under a 1993 agreement negotiated between Buckingham Palace and the UK government, designed specifically to prevent royal wealth from being taxed into oblivion every time it passed from one monarch to the next, generation after generation, the sovereign's estate transfers to their successor, entirely free of inheritance tax. That meant Charles became the sole beneficiary of his mother's private fortune, not split among the 4 royal siblings according to any kind of equal division, not shared out through some family trust designed to provide for everyone. All of it, by law and by long-standing precedent stretching back decades, went directly to the new king, and to the new king alone. For Princess Anne, who has largely stayed out of the public commentary around royal finances throughout her entire life, this seemed to generate remarkably little visible friction, consistent with her reputation as the most work-focused and least publicity-driven member of the family. But for Prince Andrew, already isolated within the family following his settlement in the Virginia Giuffre civil case and his subsequent removal from public royal duties, a fall from grace that had already cost him his military titles, his public role, and much of his previous income, reports began circulating that he felt overlooked, even resentful, that Charles had not chosen to share any portion of that £650 million estate among his siblings. Multiple outlets, including The Independent, reported claims that Andrew was said to be in a state of what was described as despair over the situation, watching his brother consolidate control over a fortune built up over 70 years of their mother's reign, while his own financial situation grew increasingly precarious following the loss of his public role and the funding that had once come along with it. And this is where Edward enters the financial conversation in a way that goes well beyond the Duke of Edinburgh title alone. As the only sibling still functioning as a full working member of the royal family alongside Charles, Edward occupies a genuinely unique position within this story. He continues to receive support through the sovereign grant, the annual public funding mechanism, paid for by taxpayers, that covers the monarchy's official expenses and the upkeep of working royals carrying out engagements on the crown's behalf, in a way that Andrew, stripped of his working royal status entirely, simply does not and cannot access anymore. Royal finance analysts have suggested that as Charles reshapes the monarchy's structure for a smaller, more streamlined future, one built around fewer working royals and tighter public spending, Edward's continued usefulness as a working royal, combined with his now confirmed hold on the Edinburgh title, positions him for a far more secure and financially favorable future than either of his other siblings could reasonably expect at this stage. It's also worth remembering just how differently the four royal siblings have navigated life in the public eye, because that context matters enormously when trying to understand why this inheritance situation carries so much weight now. Charles, of course, spent nearly 7 decades as heir apparent, the longest wait for the throne in British history, a position that came with immense privilege, but also immense scrutiny over every relationship, every misstep, and every public statement he ever made. Anne built her identity around relentless, unglamorous public service, reportedly completing more official engagements most years than any other working royal, all while largely avoiding the tabloid spotlight that so often consumed her siblings. Andrew, for a period in the 70s and 80s, was considered the dashing, glamorous one, a Falklands War veteran whose early popularity briefly rivaled Charles's own public profile before decades of controversial friendships and, eventually, formal allegations of serious wrongdoing dismantled his royal career entirely. And Edward, the youngest of the four, spent years struggling to find where he fit into a family with so few obvious lanes left open to him. Understanding these four very different trajectories helps explain why the current inheritance situation feels so loaded, because it isn't just about titles and money in the abstract. It's about which siblings' decades of choices ultimately paid off, and which siblings' choices left them out in the cold. That's the context. That's the build-up, laid out piece by piece. A title deferred for over 20 years, tied up in a promise made at a wedding most people have long forgotten. A vacancy following Philip's death that Charles didn't fill immediately, choosing instead to sit on the title himself for reasons that were never fully explained to the public. A financial landscape where one sibling was left feeling shut out and resentful, while another was quietly being positioned for long-term stability and continued relevance. And now, all of this converges on the man who has the most at stake in how it all resolves. Not Andrew, not Anne, but William, the person who will one day have to decide what happens to every single piece of this puzzle when the crown eventually passes to him. It's worth taking a moment here to think about the mechanics of how royal wealth actually works. because most people watching this have never had reason to think it through in this much detail. The Crown Estate, worth billions of pounds and encompassing everything from central London real estate to vast stretches of the English seabed, technically belongs to the reigning monarch, but is managed independently, with the profits handed over to the Treasury, in exchange for the sovereign grant that funds official royal duties. That's separate entirely from the Duchy of Lancaster, which has historically funded the monarch's private and semi-official expenses, and separate again from the Duchy of Cornwall, which funds whoever holds the title Prince or Princess of Wales, currently William himself, following Charles's accession, and separate again from the late Queen's own personal, private fortune, the £650 million we've been discussing, built up over 7 decades through investments, property, and inherited wealth, passed down from her own father, King George VI. 4 completely different financial structures, each with its own rules, its own beneficiaries, and its own level of public transparency, all operating simultaneously within the same family. Is it any wonder that stories like this one get confusing fast, or that the general public struggles to keep track of who actually controls what? Even seasoned royal correspondents have admitted, in unguarded moments, that the full picture of royal finances remains deliberately opaque, structured in a way that makes it extraordinarily difficult for outsiders, journalists included, to ever fully map out where the money actually goes. So how exactly did this quiet, decades-long arrangement suddenly explode into headline news in 2026? That's exactly where we're headed next. So what actually happened that pushed this story from background tension into the headline-grabbing moment we're discussing today? According to royal commentary that circulated widely in the first half of 2026, the confirmation didn't come from a grand palace announcement or a formal statement read out solemnly by a press officer standing outside the gates. It came, as these things increasingly do in the modern royal era, through legal and administrative channels, paperwork, filings, and confirmations tied to Edward's formal status that made clear the Duke of Edinburgh arrangement was not some symbolic placeholder waiting to be revisited, but a fully locked-in, legally recognized inheritance with real, lasting consequences. Sources close to royal reporting circles described the reaction inside the palace as one of controlled alarm, not because anyone within the family actually disputed that Edward was entitled to what he'd been promised decades earlier, but because of how the confirmation reignited questions that many observers had assumed were already settled back in 2023. Questions about permanence, about precedent, and about what it means for the next monarch's authority. Here's the crux of it, the part that actually matters if you want to understand why this story has legs. While the palace's original 2023 statement was carefully designed to reassure everyone that James would never inherit the title, and that William's line would retain the final say over its future use, the fresh confirmation reportedly went further than expected, in cementing just how much authority and permanence Edward's position now carries as a senior working royal within the modern monarchy. For a man who spent much of his younger life dismissed as the least consequential of the Queen's 4 children, mocked relentlessly for quitting the Marines, overshadowed by Charles's destiny as heir, by Anne's tireless work ethic, and even, for a time, by Andrew's early popularity as the Queen's reported favorite, Edward has, according to these reports, quietly ended up in one of the most stable and secure positions in the entire family. No scandal attached to his name, no controversy trailing behind him, just decades of steady, unremarkable, consistent service that, in the long run, appears to have paid off in a way few people inside or outside the family predicted back when he was still being written off as the family's underachiever. And this is reportedly where William comes into sharper focus. As heir apparent, William isn't just a passive bystander watching his uncle's fortunes rise from a comfortable distance. Every decision Charles makes about titles, about funding, about the overall structure of the monarchy is a decision William will eventually have to live with, manage, or actively unwind once he becomes king himself. Royal analysts have pointed out repeatedly that William has been vocal, through his own household team and through carefully placed briefings to trusted royal correspondents over the years, about wanting a smaller, more cost-effective monarchy when his time on the throne eventually arrives. A monarchy with fewer working royals drawing on public funds year after year. A tighter, more focused institution, built primarily around himself, Kate, and their 3 children as the central figures of the family's public life. Edward's confirmed, secure position as a long-term working royal with a permanent-for-life title complicates that streamlined vision in ways that are, according to commentators who follow these dynamics closely, not lost on William at all. So when reports surfaced describing William's private reaction to the confirmation, described by sources as measured and controlled, but clearly attentive, with the prince reportedly seeking detailed briefings from his team on exactly what the Edinburgh arrangement means for future decisions about royal titles and public funding going forward, it wasn't hard to see why this mattered to him personally. This isn't just uncle and nephew family business playing out quietly behind palace doors. It's William effectively looking at the shape of the monarchy he's going to inherit one day, and realizing that some of its foundations were poured by decisions made years, even decades, before he ever takes the throne himself. Doesn't that put the whole situation in a completely different light? This isn't a simple family favor. This is architecture. This is William, watching the blueprint of his own future reign being drawn up by other hands, long before he gets to hold the pen himself. There's also the question of Kate's role in all of this, one that royal watchers rarely discuss, but that arguably matters just as much as William's own reaction. As future queen consort, Kate has spent years quietly building her own priorities around family, mental health advocacy, and early childhood development, largely staying above the fray of internal royal politics and financial disputes. But sources close to the Wales household have suggested that Kate and William discussed the long-term shape of the monarchy together extensively, particularly since William took on more senior responsibilities following his father's cancer diagnosis and his own increased public role. If William's vision for the monarchy truly is a leaner, more focused institution, centered around his own immediate family, then decisions like the one securing Edward's position for life aren't just administrative footnotes to him, they're active complications, in a plan he and Kate have reportedly been shaping together for years. One engagement, one strategic decision, and one carefully placed briefing at a time. There's a historical echo here too, one worth pointing out for context. This isn't the first time a British monarch has had to balance sentimental loyalty to family against the practical demands of a leaner institution. Queen Elizabeth II herself spent decades managing similar tensions, deciding which family members would receive public funding, which titles would be created or withheld, and how to balance the personal bonds of a large family against the practical realities of running a modern constitutional monarchy under constant public scrutiny. Charles, in many ways, is following in his mother's footsteps by trying to honor personal loyalty without completely abandoning the push toward modernization. Whether William continues that same balancing act or breaks from it entirely once he's king remains one of the biggest open questions hanging over the entire institution right now. Charles's position throughout all of this has reportedly been about balance, honoring his father's wishes as faithfully as he could, rewarding a brother who has, by all accounts, been one of the most loyal and dependable members of the family throughout the most turbulent decades in the monarchy's recent history, while still preserving flexibility for William's future reign whenever it eventually begins. That's the final decision at the heart of this story. Not a single dramatic announcement delivered from a balcony or a formal press conference, but the cumulative result of choices Charles has made and quietly reaffirmed since becoming king. Choices that lock in Edward's position for the remainder of his life, while still leaving William, as the next monarch, room to make his own calls when the crown eventually passes to him. It's a compromise, in other words. A careful, deliberate compromise between honoring the past and protecting the future. And like most compromises in royal history, it satisfies almost everyone just enough to avoid open conflict, without fully satisfying anyone completely. The fallout from all of this has played out less like a single explosive confrontation behind closed palace doors, and more like a slow, steady redistribution of power and public perception within the family. The kind of gradual shift that royal watchers only fully appreciate in hindsight, once enough pieces have fallen into place to see the full picture. For Edward, The outcome is, by nearly every measure available to us, a clear win. After decades of being the quietest, least discussed, and most frequently overlooked member of the Queen's 4 children, he now holds a title with real historical weight attached to it, a stable and secure role within the working monarchy going forward, and financial backing that appears secure for the remainder of his active royal life. Commentators have noted the irony here repeatedly, that the sibling once seen as the family's underachiever, the one who couldn't finish Marine training and struggled to find his professional footing, has ended up with arguably the most secure and least contested position of any of Elizabeth's 4 children as the monarchy heads into its next generation. For Andrew, the story lands very differently, and arguably far less favorably. Already stripped of his public royal duties following the fallout from his own scandals, and reportedly nursing resentment over being excluded entirely from any share of the late Queen's £650 million estate, watching Edward's position become further entrenched and further secured is, according to royal commentators tracking his situation closely, unlikely to sit well with him at all. Some analysts have suggested that Andrew's isolation, financial, social, and institutional all at once, only deepens further whenever these kinds of confirmations surface and remind the wider public of just how differently his siblings' fortunes have diverged since his own dramatic fall from grace began. It's a stark contrast, isn't it? 2 brothers, born into the exact same family, given the exact same starting point in life, and ending up in positions so far apart from one another that it's almost hard to believe they grew up under the same roof. Andrew's situation has only grown more complicated in recent years, with continued public pressure over his previous ties to Jeffrey Epstein, the loss of his HRH usage in public contexts, and his eventual relocation away from Royal Lodge amid ongoing scrutiny over the terms of that property arrangement. Every time a story like this one about Edward surfaces, it inevitably reopens comparisons between the 2 brothers, one who kept his head down, avoided controversy, and is now being rewarded for it, and one whose choices led him further and further from the center of royal life with each passing year. It's also worth considering how this situation looks from Sophie's perspective, and from the perspective of their children, James and Louise. Unlike Andrew's daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, who have largely built lives and careers outside formal royal duties, James and Louise have been raised with a much more understated public profile, appearing at major royal events, but rarely thrust into the spotlight the way William and Harry's children sometimes are. With James now confirmed not to inherit the Duke of Edinburgh title, and with Louise widely expected to eventually take on a greater working role within the family as she gets older, the next generation of Edward's branch of the family is shaping up quite differently than many expected a decade ago. Some royal commentators have speculated that this understated approach may actually serve the family well in the long run, positioning Edward's children as reliable, scandal-free contributors to a slimmed-down monarchy, rather than as figures competing for the spotlight alongside William and Kate's own children. Anne, characteristically, has stayed almost entirely outside the public conversation surrounding this entire saga, a pattern that has defined her measured, low-drama approach to royal controversy for decades now. Her position as the hardest-working member of the family by public engagement, count year after year, has never seemed contingent on titles or headline-grabbing inheritance battles. And this situation appears, at least so far, to be no exception to that lifelong pattern. But the most consequential fallout, according to those who track the monarchy's long-term trajectory closely, belongs squarely to William. Every additional piece of permanence built into the current structure, every confirmed title, every locked-in funding arrangement, every decision Charles makes now to honor the past, is one more variable William will have to account for when he eventually reshapes the monarchy around his own vision for its future. Some royal commentators have framed this as a quiet, simmering tension point worth watching closely in the years ahead. William reportedly wants a leaner, more modern institution built for a smaller number of working royals, while Charles's decisions, made in the name of family loyalty and honoring his own father's legacy, have arguably made that leaner future slightly harder to achieve cleanly, once William finally takes the throne. This mirrors, in some ways, the broader challenge facing monarchies across Europe, many of which have been forced to modernize and streamline their public funding structures in response to shifting public opinion. The Dutch and Scandinavian royal families, for example, have already trimmed their working membership down to immediate family only in recent decades, a model some analysts believe William personally admires and may look to emulate once decisions about the British monarchy's future structure rest entirely in his hands rather than his father's. Whether William views this as a genuine obstacle standing in the way of his vision, or simply a manageable detail he'll address once he's king and has full authority to reshape things as he sees fit, is something only time, and William's own choices as monarch, will ultimately reveal to the rest of us. There's also a public relations dimension to all of this that shouldn't be overlooked. In an era where the monarchy's continued existence increasingly depends on public goodwill and perceived value for money, every story about internal family finances carries risk for the institution as a whole. Polling on the monarchy in Britain has shown a gradual softening of support among younger generations, in particular, with cost and relevance cited repeatedly as top concerns. A story suggesting that one member of the family has quietly secured a lifetime of financial and titular security, while another sibling nurses public resentment over exclusion from a £650 million inheritance, is exactly the kind of narrative palace communications teams work overtime to manage carefully. Whether they've succeeded in shaping the story the way they intended, or whether it's slipped somewhat beyond their control given how widely it's now being discussed, is very much up for debate among those who watch royal communications strategy closely. What's clear, even now, is that this isn't a closed chapter in the story of this family. The Duke of Edinburgh title, the £650 million estate, the unresolved tension simmering with Andrew, the delicate balancing act between honoring the past and preparing for William's future. All of it remains part of a larger, still unfolding story about how the modern British monarchy manages wealth, loyalty, and succession simultaneously, often under intense public scrutiny every step of the way. Charles has made his decision for now, and by most accounts, he appears settled on it. But kings, even reigning ones, don't get the final word forever. One day, and possibly sooner than many expect given ongoing concerns about his health, all of this becomes William's to manage, William's to reshape, and William's to answer for. So where does this leave things heading into the years ahead, and what should you actually be watching for next? With Charles's health continuing to be a subject of public concern and speculation since his cancer diagnosis became public in early 2024, questions about the pace of transition within the monarchy have only grown louder among royal watchers and commentators alike. Every decision made now, about titles, about money, about who holds what and for how long, is, in a very real sense, William quietly inheriting the blueprint for his own future reign, piece by piece, years before he ever formally takes the throne himself. The Edward situation may be settled on paper for now, locked in through legal confirmation and years of precedent, but the broader question of how William will ultimately restructure the family once he's king remains genuinely wide open, with no clear answer available to any of us watching from the outside. Will he honor these arrangements exactly as his father carefully left them, out of respect for family tradition and continuity? Or will a leaner, more streamlined monarchy mean revisiting decisions that Charles worked so deliberately and so carefully to lock into place during his own reign? And what happens to Andrew's situation in the meantime? Does his reported resentment over the estate ever boil over into something more public, the way so many other royal grievances eventually have in recent years? These are the threads worth watching closely as this story continues to develop in the months ahead, because in this family, very few chapters ever stay closed for long. That's where we want to hear directly from you. Do you think William will keep the monarchy's current structure fully intact when he eventually becomes king, or do you think a genuinely slimmed-down royal family is inevitable once the crown finally passes to him? And second, do you think Charles made the right call in securing Edward's position the way he did, rewarding decades of quiet loyalty with real permanence? Or should more of that focus have gone toward preparing William for the leaner, more modern future he's reportedly planning for the institution? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because we genuinely read every single one, and some of the best insights on this channel come directly from this community. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the inner workings of royal inheritance, titles, and the quiet power struggles that shape the monarchy's future behind closed doors, make sure you're subscribed to Royal Unbeatable and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story the palace would rather you didn't hear about in this much detail. We'll be back soon with more on this unfolding situation as new details continue to emerge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.